Welcome to the Innovators Book Club. In each episode we take a well-known book on innovation, discuss it, dissect it, and see what we can learn. In this episode we're looking at The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. Let's get started. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Innovators Book Club. This week we're tackling the big one, the one that probably everybody refers to most in terms of theories of innovation, and that's The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, the Harvard Business scholar and professor. So to guide us through the discussion this week, we're going to change it up a little bit. Michael Avis in Denver, Professor Michael Avis, is going to guide the discussion, lead us through. So Michael, you there in Denver?
I'm here. Thanks, Tim. I will take it from here. Before we move any further, though, I think we should introduce everybody on the line. We have, again, the same cast of global characters. We have Ninetta Koswig in Boston.
Hi, everyone.
We have Alex Dayer in Boston. Hello. And we have Mitch Meisterjan, points unknown.
Guten Abend.
Where are you, Bonn? Bonn, Germany?
That's right.
Okay. Oh, great. So everybody, what we're going to, as Tim said, we're going to tackle The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, and I'm going to give a high-level summary of the book, and then we're going to jump right into the different pieces. I think it's going to be a very good discussion today because there are a lot of moving parts and quite a long history in effect for the space we're talking about. So The Innovator's Dilemma was first published in 1997. To summarize the book, Christensen has a thesis in which he describes the fact that very successful companies can fail by doing the right things, listening to their customers, following their product lines, and he introduces the notion at the time called disruptive technologies, since then known as disruptive innovation, that what happens is that low margins, entrant-level companies can be successful by attacking the places, disrupting incumbent businesses precisely because those incumbent businesses are not equipped or prepared to deal with those markets, do not see them on the rise, and don't understand the low margin, the weaker product line, the cheaper, simpler innovation that's emerging, and are unable to react soon enough to deal with it. What the book does is, in the first part of the book, he actually outlines how this is possible. He cites a number of cases, most specifically and dramatically the disk drive industry. And then part two, he goes on to apply those principles, the principles he develops in part one, and he says these are the 5 principles that need to be adhered to as an incumbent to deal with disruptive technologies. And then we have some different types of cases in practice in the second part of the book. So what we're going to do today is kind of split this up with our teams, and they're going to discuss for the part one and part two, and then we're going to move into a little bit of the criticism and the history since 1997 that have been associated with the book. So I believe Tim, Woods, and Ninetta have part one. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So we'll try and keep this pretty simple and high level. The first thing to note is it's a really detailed book. So I think the original substance of the book is based on Clayton Christensen's original PhD thesis. So it's very detailed, lots of graphs, lots of in-depth studies of the disk drive industry and all of the complexities of that. But just to keep it at a very high level, so the first thing to note is, and you touched on it a little bit, is the difference between sustaining versus disruptive innovations or technologies. And I think that that's really where a lot of the misuses of this start, by miscategorizing technologies in one or the other category. So sustaining innovations are really the bulk of all innovations around the world in every single industry. They are mostly of the sustaining nature, according to Christensen anyway. And what sustaining means is that it's offering up more and better value for existing customers. That can be substantially big improvements. So for one interesting example, he considers the iPhone a sustaining innovation, not disruptive. And I think a lot of people would then scratch their head and say, well, what exactly do you mean? And that's because he's saying the iPhone itself is just a better version of what was already available. It's targeting the same kinds of customers that the market was already targeting. So it was a sustaining improvement. A disruptive innovation, on the other hand, is often worse in product performance. It comes in at the bottom of the market typically, although we'll get onto that in a minute. There's been a revision to his theory a little bit. But often disruptive innovations begin with worse performance criteria, and they serve only a small portion of the market, and it's the lower end of the market. And that's usually people that aren't willing to spend as much money, or they're looking for something super convenient or more simple or more faster to access. One of those kind of criteria. So normally it's a fringe set of customers in the market space. And one example of this might be Honda and Kawasaki introducing small off-road bikes to the American market. And of course, to begin with, these could be dismissed very easily by BMW and Harley-Davidson, but over time, these disruptive innovations move on a trajectory upwards in terms of who they're servicing in the market, and they start to get bigger and bigger margins. So maybe we can get on to that a little bit more later, but another example would be transistors overtaking vacuum tubes and TVs, and also Netflix and Blockbuster. Okay, so that's the difference, and one of the fundamental things is that the incumbents in the industry don't see it coming, and that's very important. So Clayton Christensen says that it's the process. So it's the process of which the technology is moving through the market. If it comes in under the radar, services a very niche set of customers, but then as it grows, and the leaders of the market space start to give up some of that foothold of the market and say, you know what, we don't even need to sell to these people because they're the low end, the margins are really small, let's keep moving up the chart and actually go for higher margins and more, so we say, expensive customers. And over time, a disruptive innovation gets more and more of a hold within the market and moves upwards and starts eating more of the margins that the incumbents have. We can touch on that a bit more. So just to summarize these principles you talk about, and maybe this is one of the issues, is that they're considered laws or principles. I think he mentions both those terms in the book, and that opens himself up to criticism, I think, where people say, hold on a minute, it's not really a law, like evolution, for example. But I'll list them anyway. So the first one is that companies depend on customers and investors for resources. So this is one of the problems why incumbents can't adequately deal with disruptive technologies, because their whole business model is focused on servicing the existing customers they have that are paying them the money which they invest back into R&D to then provide sustaining innovations to those customers again. And to take then a gamble and actually invest in something that's unproven and doesn't necessarily have a market is obviously a risky thing, and customers and shareholders and investors don't really tolerate that very easily. So that's the first law. The second law is small markets don't solve the growth needs of large companies, and that's a similar problem. If a company that's, say, 4 billion in revenue a year needs to grow by 20%, they need to find $800 million a year in new revenue. You don't do that with a new market. That's a very difficult problem. Whereas if you're a smaller company, let's say you're a 40 million turnover company and you need to find 20%, that's only 8 million, which in theory you could achieve 8 million with a new technology that's unproven. So it's a lot easier to handle emerging markets. The third one is that markets don't exist. Markets that don't exist cannot be analyzed. And the problem Clayton Christensen talks about here is whenever internally in a company, if you're evaluating a new business option, a new market, a new technology, the tools that we normally use to assess whether it's going to generate revenue for us or not don't really apply for emerging markets, because if there is no market, you cannot really adequately understand the size of that market yet. You cannot use the same tools that you have to assess it and decide whether it's the right thing to pursue or not. The fourth one is an organization's capabilities define its disabilities. I think Netta will talk about that a little more in terms of the value network. But one interesting point that Clayton makes is that people are flexible. Individuals themselves are flexible and they can change very easily, but processes and values do not. And a company itself is set up in a certain way to deliver a certain product that generates a certain value, and it's certain expected value as well. And it's not easy for a company to then change those processes in a completely different way, whereas individuals themselves could pursue new opportunities. So that's why it's a lot easier for a group of people to then go and form a startup and start competing in the same market space with a new technology than it is for an existing large company to change the way that it works to also deliver that technology. And finally, the fifth one is technology supply may not always equal market demand. and that's that incumbent companies that are always improving their product tend to overshoot market needs because they're fighting a competitive battle with like-minded companies on a sort of even basis, and those competitors have the same cost structures and the same customers as well. And between that fight, they often end up going way beyond what the actual market needs. And that leaves a room at the very bottom of the market for a more convenient, more simpler, cheaper even, product. And that's where newcomers can actually get a foothold into the market. So those are the 5 principles. And he wraps this up as what he would call his failure framework. So this is the way that we can test and analyze why companies fail. And also, if you understand these laws, apparently, then you have a much better chance of fighting off disruptive innovation when it happens. So I'll hand over to Ninetta just to touch on an important point, which is the value network idea.
All right, so the concept of value networks is key to his idea, and you can get to value networks when you look at the product architecture. So you look at the individual components, and each component in your product has its own market and different producers providing those components as a product. So when you look at the product architecture, you see that the products are actually embedded or nested hierarchically in other products, again as components, and eventually within a certain system of use, and this resulting commercial system is what Christensen refers to as value networks. Okay, an example, back to the disk drive here, a company that manufactures disk drives buys their components to assemble those drives from different manufacturers, and then one level up you have the disk drive again as being a component for a company that assembles notebook computers. And then again, those notebook computers are part of what he refers to as portable personal computing as end system of use. And the key idea to this concept of value networks is that the value is measured different across the different networks. So in a different value network, different attributes of the product are considered valuable. And again, the disk drives as example, when you look at mainframe computers, the value that is important to them is high capacity, speed, and reliability. And then when you look at disk drives for portable computing, the values are different. The small size, the low power consumption, and ruggedness is what is important to them. So in those different networks, different attributes define what is valuable. And in addition to measuring value differently, each value network also has a certain cost structure. When you look at mainframe computers, they have a high cost for research and development, they have really high costs for their sales force, and in the end, the profit margins that they need to be profitable and cover their overhead costs need to be like 50 to 60%. And then when you compare that to the value network of portable computing, they approach it differently. They use proven components. They have low costs for manufacturing because they go and assemble in low labor cost countries. And the way they sell is much cheaper with them going through retail chains or mail order. So in this value network, a profit margin of 15 or 20% is sufficient to cover the overhead costs. And when you look at new technologies or innovations, innovations that are valued within the firm's own network or in a network with higher gross margins, those are the ones that are perceived as profitable. And on the contrary, if there's a new innovation or new technology that is valued in networks with lower margins, then this is not considered to be profitable and it's not interesting for the management of this company, and those technologies will be ignored. And in general, to maximize their profits, companies will always try to move to markets with higher margins in other value networks, and this is what Christensen refers to, that the companies are always moving towards the northeastern corner. And I think Tim wanted to go into a little bit more detail about the mills.
Yeah, I find the mini mills case probably the most interesting in the book for me. So there are 3 major studies that he dives into. One is the disk drive industry. Personally, I found that a little bit sluggish to get through. It's interesting, but it's it's quite complicated to really understand with all the changes happening in the industry. The second one is the mechanical excavators, which is also interesting, but I think has some real fundamental problems, which maybe we'll talk about later. But the third one is the steel industry. And what happened was that mini mills started popping up that were sort of 1/10 of the cost of integrated mills. Integrated mills are the big classic steel making mills. And the mini mills only did one thing to begin with, and that's that they produce reinforcing steel bars called rebar. And that's really the crappy end of the market. It's where there's really not much profit margin to be made. There's not a lot of complexity to it. It's a pretty ugly business, really. But that's where the mini mills got their start, and that's where companies like Nucor began. And what's interesting about this is that it's quite crystal clear what happened. So the larger companies, with their billion-dollar investments in their mills, producing very high-quality steel, such as aluminium or steel for tin cans and cars. So very refined sheet steel metal. They looked at rebar as a real pain because there wasn't much money in it, and they were quite happy to get rid of it. So when they're looking at what was happening with the competition at the low end of the market, they were more than delighted to actually say, forget that, let's keep moving up market and concentrate on the higher margin steel areas and leave that to these guys to deal with at the bottom, the rebar stuff. And that's where this concept of northeasterly drift comes in. So if you think of a chart, on the left axis is product quality, and on the bottom axis is time. And you can see that over time, these integrated mills just kept moving up into the right-hand corner over time. They kept saying, let's find things that we can sell which are higher profit, higher quality, that we can do really well. And they're leaving the bottom of the market really exposed, which is where Nucor and others came in and said, you know what, we can do rebar. And actually, over time, they started to say, we can do more than rebar. We can go up one level and start doing, rods and steel bars. And that's the next run of the ladder. And over time, and of course, this took quite a long time, 20 years or so, eventually Nucor is attacking the entire grid. And the integrated mills are finding their ability to maneuver really restricted. So that's the interesting case of northeasterly drift that seems to be happening in a lot of markets. But I think in the steel industry, it was very quite crystal clear to understand what was happening. And eventually, Nucor, of course, starts equaling the profits that the larger companies were. And obviously, Nucor is a famous case that's also in Good to Great as well. So yeah, that's it, Michael. Hopefully, we explained the basis of the book, and you can take it from there.
Basis of part one. Yeah, and I think that's pretty good because you teed up the principles pretty good for what we're going to move into in part two. One thing you touched on the failure framework, I thought was one of the things that we have to keep in mind that I think gets overlooked is that there was already a lot of literature and a lot of history about how big firms fail in the first place. And so this is an opening that he starts with, and you mentioned it coming from his doctoral work, and we'll get into that more, I'm sure, as we move forward. But the interesting thing is that this idea of the failure framework starts with a lot of literature and theories already in place. So this is just the disruptive innovation, the innovator's dilemma, is a new thesis coming at why companies fail in the first place, and I think that becomes important because it allows them to change the conversation, and we can talk about how impactful that's been when we look at the part two of the book where he actually moves into the principles. So, Mitch, is that you?
What?
Ready to go?
Here. Oh, yes, of course.
So go ahead, take away. Part two is all about now applying these principles that Tim laid out for us, that Tim and Ninetta laid out for us.
Right. So the 5 principles of great companies that deal successfully with innovations are really the core of this book, right? So it's a 230-page book, and they started around page 100 or something and cover the whole rest of the book. And however, we are trying, Alex and I will try to summarize them as much as possible for you, and still try to shape them out, really get what it's about. So the first principle is resource dependence. This principle is simply based on the notion that customers determine where resources in a company are allocated. And this one I really want to quote from the book directly because Christensen puts it very nicely here. He says, good resource allocation processes are designed to weed out proposals that customers don't want. When these decision-making processes work well, if customers don't want a product, it won't get funded. If they do want it, it will. This is how things must work in great companies. They must invest in things customers want. And the better they become at doing this, the more successful they will be. So this is a crucial thing here. So, because if you adhere to this principle, you have to address the right type of customers to make sure that your disruptive venture will be successful in the end. A practical example he gives several for each of these principles, but just to take one out, is Quantum. They missed the 5.25-inch disk market when they entered it 4 years after it actually emerged. But then some of their employees saw some potential for the new 3.5-inch disk market. And to make a long story short, they spun off a new independent venture called Plus and retained 80% ownership. When then the old 8 and 5.25-inch product started to disappear, they actually purchased the remaining 20% of Plus, installed its management in the leading management positions at Quantum, and closed their old business down. In that way, they were very successfully and thoroughly reallocated resources to this new market. This is a very extreme example, but it shows how far it can go. So the second principle then is that small markets are often overlooked. Why is that? Companies need to grow for several reasons, obviously. Growth has a positive impact on the share prices. It gives room for high potential employees to expand their responsibilities and therefore motivates them to stay with the company. And of course, growing companies find it much easier to justify investments of any kind. So taking growth as a central goal, it becomes obvious that the more a company grows, the more difficult it becomes to maintain a certain rate of growth. Tim in the beginning already mentioned those number examples that he gives us. So if you have a 40 million company and you would grow it by 20%, it needs 8 million to grow. For a 4 billion company, it would be already at 800 million. So obviously, new and emerging markets, like the one for disruptive technologies, rarely ever have this size, if you can guesstimate the size at all. So therefore, it does not make sense for a big company to pursue new disruptive markets. So now that poses a problem, obviously, for many big companies. There are 3 ways to deal with this. One is to try to affect the growth rate of an emerging market. You could just try and make it grow faster. Then a second option would be to wait until the market has emerged and become better defined. However, that is also an issue, as we just saw with Quantum, who missed the 5.25-inch disk market when they just entered it 4 years afterwards. And then the third option you can pursue, and this is the one he actually suggests, is pursue disruptive technologies with companies that are small enough to have an interest in the revenues to be expected. And to give you an example for this principle, I'll just choose Control Data Corporation, I guess. They made business in the 14-inch drive market, and as Christensen puts it, it took $1 million order just to turn anyone's head. However, to address the newly emerging 5.25-inch market, they would have founded a subsidiary that was small enough to get excited about a 50K deal. And this is the point. Eventually, you will have to found a subsidiary, get an incubator, whatever, have a spun-off business that is independent from your large company that can take care of the new disruptive market. Then, principle 3, failure is an intrinsic step forwards towards the success of a disruptive technology. The theory is pretty simple. You cannot forecast the development of an unknown market. Therefore, you have to expect failure. That's pretty simple, actually, but I really love this point because in the past years we have read so much about embracing failure and this weird Silicon Valley mantra that you can read everywhere on the internet about. And the point is, though, that it is actually not about failure. It's all about the learning that comes with it. There's also the core notion that, in Rees' work, the Lean Startup, which we've tackled earlier in one of our book club reviews. However, nobody ever said that embracing failure for its own sake is of any use. It just doesn't make any sense. It's simply a misinterpretation of what Christensen says. So the point is, failure is to be expected, and the opportunity has to be seized. But it's all about the learning. A practical example is what Tim already mentioned at the beginning. Honda is a pretty awesome example because they wanted to invade the North American motorcycle industry. They conducted some research and found out that Americans mainly use their bikes for over-the-road rides with size, power, and speed being the main criteria for the purchase. I'm sure Michael can back that up. However, they couldn't offer anything better than lower cost in comparison to a Harley-Davidson, for example. And at some point, when the dealers were actually willing to try their bikes out, it showed that they couldn't handle the stress of lengthy periods of override. So the technology was just not good enough, and so everything was perceived as a major failure. However, then the frustrated executives seemingly took their little Super Cup off-road bikes into the hills just to vent their frustration, basically. And over the years, they just created a hype about these little agile, lightweight off-road bikes, and more or less founded the off-road market for motorbikes in the U.S. And yeah, that was principle 3, and I would like to hand over to Alex here.
Sure. So, looking at the fourth principle here, that Clayton outlines is relating to the organization's capabilities. And the capabilities that reside within an organization define that their process and values, and that these various process and values that constitute the core capabilities within the current business model of that organization also define their disabilities when confronted with disruption. And he goes into more detail about these 3 factors that affect what an organization can and cannot do. Its resources, which he defines as the people, equipment, technology, product design, etc. Basically anything that's a thing or an asset within an organization. Secondly, its processes, which are the patterns of interaction, coordination, communication, and decision-making through which an organization creates value by transforming inputs of its resources into products and services. Thirdly, the values of an organization, which are the criteria by which decisions and priorities are made. And he goes into detail about these and how organizations use these when confronting disruptive change. And he says typically, and in pretty much most cases, and again he's using examples from the disk drive industry here, leading companies that had all these defined resources, processes, and values failed because they tried to use their existing processes and values to confront this change. And he gives the example of a digital equipment corporation, which was very successful in making mini computers, but when they tried to enter the personal computer market, they failed. They had resources was not a problem. They had vast resources, but when they tried to use their existing values and processes from the mini computer market into the personal computer market, they just didn't mesh. Being a different market completely, they didn't know how to deal with that within their own organization. And he goes on to give more examples of things which are great, but he points out the fact that the resources is really all that's key when confronting a disruptive organization, and that when managers are confronted with a disruption, they have 3 options. They can either try to change their existing processes and values in their current organization to fit this new disruption, which he points out historically does not work. And if it does work, it is a long and hard road and is met with limited success. Alternatively, they can try to acquire a different organization whose processes and values are a close match with the new task. He gives the example of Cisco and Johnson & Johnson, which historically have done this through acquisitions, and then that separate organization has the ability to develop in this new market without the constraints of the existing organization. Kind of going back to that first point that Michael expounded upon of resource dependence. And thirdly, which he recommends this one as the best option, is splitting out an independent organization and developing within it the new processes and values. Looking at, again, examples from the disk drive industry and others where managers have successfully harnessed this principle. They have utilized the resources of the mainstream organization to address the disruption, but they're very careful not to leverage its processes and values to keep that separation. Moving on to the 5th principle, technology supply may not equal market demand. And relating to the fact that the attributes of disruptive technologies that typically are unattractive to the mainstream market are often the very ones that constitute their value in emerging markets. And he goes into detail at the beginning of this chapter looking at the product life cycle and what that is. And I'm going to use the example he has in the book of the disruptive industry to kind of explain this. So when people are looking at all the various options they have for a particular product, in this case a disk drive, they look at the criteria and what they judge on. And there's always a first measure of that, and that's the very beginning of the product life cycle. In the disk drive industry, it was capacity. And at the beginning, the capacity in the market need was higher than what was able to be produced. But over time, the established markets gradually increased their capacity until it was well above what the market required, which, as we already mentioned earlier, is a marker for a disruptive change entering the market, and that's what happened. A smaller disk drive emerged, which had much lower capacity than the market need. So at that time, the established market still held the market share of the value because they had the capacity. But over time, the capacity of the disruptive change gradually emerged and increased and went to that upper right corner of the graph, and eventually met the market need and again surpassed it. At that point, there were multiple options in the capacity criteria for the disk drive. So the life cycle shifted to the next criteria, which was physical size, and that's what people judged on what they wanted to choose. And again, this goes over time from physical size. Once that was played through, reliability was next, and pricing. He gives a really nice graph on this on page 188, detailing this over time, how the life cycle of the disk drive industry and the criteria by which people judged and chose a product really emerged, and over time went from capacity to physical size to reliability and to price, and eventually became a commodity. And looking at two additional characteristics of disruptive technology, he calls them, and again I'm going to quote here from the book. There are two other important things to remember when looking at a product life cycle and how it affects the competitive dynamics. One, that the attributes that make a disruptive product worthless in mainstream markets typically become their strongest selling points in emerging markets. In an emerging market, such as the disk drive industry, the physical size really wasn't a comparison at the beginning because the smaller one couldn't have the capacity. But at the same time, there were markets and emerging markets that they found that where a smaller size was an advantage. And that's really what took them off. They got their start. And again, that goes back to this product life cycle. The second point, that disruptive products tend to be simpler, cheaper, and more reliable and convenient than established products, which is, again, looking at the lower end, the farther the time goes on, the more important that those become in that product life cycle. And to conclude, I mean, he points out that managers that successfully harness this principle utilize, when looking at a disruptive technology, they find and develop the new markets that for these simpler, cheaper, and more reliable products that aren't valued in the mainstream market, but they find the market that does value them, and that value network can utilize that.
Michael? Michael, you there?
I was on mute, I'm sorry. Alex, that was pretty good. Do you have any information on the case study?
Yes, so looking at the case study, he goes into the example of the electric car and basically walks through his principles that he lays out looking at that industry. And I was intrigued by this because obviously he's writing this, well, 1997, almost 20 years ago. Obviously that electric market has changed a lot in that time period. But he steps through this using his principles and how he would, as a manager confronting this electric car, and how he would deal with that in his company. And he starts out by looking at whether or not the electric car is a disruptive technology or not. And the criteria he defines for this is what people are looking for in a car would be top speed, range, and time it takes a car to get from 0 to 60 miles per hour, as a few of them. And according to that, he determines that yes, this electric car is a disruptive technology because it doesn't meet any of those, what the market requires and the market needs those. It's very low on that scale. So then he takes and looks at where is the market, or would the market be, for an electric vehicle, and what they could either find or create. He makes a point for teenage drivers, and that parents might want to buy a shorter range, smaller power car for their kids to drive around just to get to school and to sports events or anything, but don't want them to have the market need at that level would be lower and would be sufficient for the electric car. And he goes on to expound other potential markets and how, looking at how automobile companies are currently marketing electric cars, where they're trying to just market them in their established market instead of looking for those new markets where the product could really excel. And then taking a look at, well, they're doing that, how can we find this new market, how can we define our product and our technology and our distribution strategies to fit a new market that we could find. And then, again, pointing out the fact that to do this effectively, they would need to spin off a new organization that's separate from their existing organization that could deal with this, be excited about the little win, and grow in the market that is grow as an organization in the size that's relative to the size of the market that they're in.
Very good, very good. I think that, and just let me kind of, jump in here right now, especially consideration of time. That was a really good job, Alex and Mitch, pulling the principles together. And that the interesting thing about the case study is he's really trying to show, in effect, a real-world application, and at the same time, he never tries to show that he's going to create an electric vehicle company as a disruptive company that would be an entrant, but instead talks in terms of the theory and focuses more on the value network and the failure framework, because GM and the big car makers were already under these discussions and burdened by the technology, because they thought exactly like they had always thought, which is the point of the thesis in the first place. Which actually draws me into one of the things that we wanted to actually touch on, in addition to how the book is laid out and what's important about it, is the response in the marketplace, in effect, in the business world, especially in terms of innovation. What's fascinating to me, first and foremost, is the book was published in 1997, and for years, literally years, all of the criticism, responses were positive, were glowing. It was a new statement on a very old problem in terms of why companies failed, and he was suggesting a third possibility. Now, the interesting thing comes is, like, I literally went and did a lot of research at Leeds Business School in Boulder, Colorado, and had a hard time finding anybody taking any of these things to task until we get to 2014. Really, was the first article called, by Jill Lepore, called "What the Gospel of Innovation Got Wrong." Interestingly, she points out some things that were where a lot of the Christensen thesis starts to break down is on pieces like, is it really truly predictive? Has the basis of his research held up? Does he have pure academic corroboration from his source materials? She points out a number of things, and just to touch on a couple, she points out that for the predictive element, for example, he opened a $3.8 million fund investment firm and closed the fund within a very, very short time, and they lost the 64% of all their investments. They obviously begging the question, and Tim touched on it with Apple, it doesn't seem to be as predictive as one would think, or that you would suppose from Christensen's model, that he's saying it's supposed to be predictive. That's interesting in and of its own, worth discussion. Another piece that she talks about is that he uses his own research material from his own dissertation as corroborating sources for points that he makes in the book, and say, the source is my work here. So it lacks that sort of differentiation, the sort of objectivity that you would hope to expect from an academic thesis. Having said all that, there's plenty of discussion for the criticism. The one thing I want to open up to the group is, in this world of of where the book came in, glowing response to the extent that Christensen has basically built an institution of disruption. It has become its own buzzword, if you will, that people think of it in many ways, misunderstand it, as he constantly points out in many articles, comes back and says that people just have misunderstood things. How do we as a group, I mean, jump in here, and maybe Tim, I'll just point to you right away because I know you and I have had conversations. What are the takeaways in terms of understanding not only with the initial premise and the initial thesis, but where we've come since that time in terms of gyrations in innovation to respond to this?
Yeah, there's a lot of points to make there, and I think one of the problems is the term itself. So who owns the term disruptive innovation? And I think Clayton Christensen is trying to say, look, if you're going to use it in my context, you've got to abide by my rules. So the problem is everything's considered a disruption. So Uber is the classic problem here for Christensen, because surely we all think Uber is a disruptive innovation. Surely, intuitively, it seems like a cast iron case. But, you know, when he puts it through his theory, he says it's not. I'm sorry, it's just not. And that's a problem for a lot of people. And I think that the question is, after 20 years, is it fair to still say that disruptive innovation is owned by Christensen, or is it now something different? You know, what role does this theory play in today's world? And one of the issues I have with it is that in 1997, when it was published, and bear in mind all the work leading up to it was from 92 onwards, so it's pretty dated. The problem is the internet became a platform after 1997, and digital disruption became a new phenomenon. And things like Uber are born out of that platform of disruption. And the question is this theory antiquated? It doesn't account for this new paradigm that the innovation, that the online world gives us. And I think that's an issue. I don't know where to go with that. I've got other points to make, but for me, that's a challenging thing for him. And I think one of the things that Jill Lepore does that I like is that she does criticize it, and she does say, hold on a minute, this disruption thing's got a bit out of hand. Everyone's going crazy. There's disruptive conferences, and you know, it's born on panic. It's born on this idea that if you don't get a grasp of this, you're screwed. You know, your whole company's going to disappear. And she makes a lot of points that actually it's not the case, really, because even in the mini mills and the excavator cases, it doesn't really pan out that way. I mean, Caterpillar ended up buying Bucyrus, I think it's called, or Bucyrus, I don't know how you pronounce it, but one of the leading cases he makes in there is Bucyrus, and Caterpillar ended up buying them for $9 billion in 2011. So, you know, was it that bad? Did they really disappear off the radar? I don't think so. But I could also defend Christensen as well, but maybe you want to step in, Michael, and run it from there.
Yeah, I was going to say, is like, well, Mitch, do you have any other points to follow up there? Because I can jump in.
Yeah, well, a couple of points actually. Well, the one thing is, I do see the general issue that Tim just raised, that the theorem might just be outdated because it was all before the internet and everything. The point is, though, why would that affect the thesis, except for that it is old? But I don't quite see in how far this challenges the thesis in general. And then regarding Lepore, she does make good examples, that's true, but she totally overdoes or overstates the use of disruption as an almost religious historical thing, and which Christensen seriously and definitely does not want to establish in his book, and which he's come back to always time and time again. So these are basically my 2 points here, but maybe Tim, you want to...
Yeah, no, maybe I can rebuff on that just quickly. So here's the issue, right? It depends who is considering it disruptive. So if you talk to taxi drivers in San Francisco, they would tell you Uber's disruptive. So Christensen says it's not, and the reason why it's not is because they didn't come in at the low end of the market. Actually, Uber went in at the top end of the market. They didn't come in with a crappy product. They came in right at the top.
The point is, though, what's the basis for the use of the term disruption that taxi drivers have? I mean, what are they drawing from?
Well,
I believe that all this vague use of this word that we have today is just still based on Christensen. It's just totally gone out of hand.
But here's his fault, though. But this is the question. No, actually, that's the question. It was like authorial intent, Christensen's own intent, because you have to admit there is no way around this problem. He comes up with a thesis which is, I think, the single takeaway here. What's really brilliant about it is it was a completely new third position. It's changed the conversation of how we talked about innovation from 97 forward. I don't disagree with it. The internet changed things too, but that's kind of the point here. Where it becomes problematic for Christensen is that if you're somebody who says, well, his own popularity or the popularity of the innovator's dilemma has, obfuscated, shadowed, or been a burden for Christensen. It's at the same time, let's face it, for better or worse, he's launched entire institution off of this and made a career statement off of this. There's no way around this. And at the same time, then what Lepore winds up doing is she's similar in some ways. She's attacking the institution of Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma by going at the source of this work right here, this particular book that's under discussion. But like no other thing that we've actually talked about before in these podcasts, that the historical, the political, the cultural ramifications of this work is much bigger than anything we've tackled before. But seriously looking at this, the level of where everybody bought into it for years. If it was just the internet, Tim, where was the criticism in 2008? Where was the criticism in 2000? When the fund went? I'm just saying, at one point there's Hayden Shaughnessy responds to Lepore, which is interesting. I think it's a Fortune article. Maybe it's Forbes. It's a Forbes article.
Yeah,
he talks about Forbes. He talks about that it's more of a debate of elite positioning. So then it's political now. And he takes that out, but that's exactly the point, is that where the conversation starts to become less about can we apply the concepts of the innovator's dilemma, the principles of the innovator's dilemma, to business still in right now. And that's the real difficulty, because we get blindsided by the fact that there are so many sidebar conversations. We get the noise in the background, the chaos surrounding all of the things that are going around in it as a political conversation, when if you just take it from 1997 and just said, if it's not as relevant, that's fine. But it did indeed start a new conversation that didn't exist prior to that in terms of why do companies fail. And it provides a framework for these principles. Are just that the best thing he says, and he doesn't come back to it, and I wish he did more, was that these principles are like looking at the things that affect gravity, wind shear, when you're trying to launch a plane off a Kitty Hawk, right? That that the engineering just was not there about aerodynamics when we were trying to get manned flight, or even unmanned flight, right? A man-made contraption to engineer and understand what we had to do to get to deal with. That was the best thing I understood about the principles. These are things to be aware of. They're not supposed to be laws. And even though he says at some point that it is supposed to be predictive, and he's lived on that ever since, I never was convinced that it's really as much predictive as just saying, if you take these into account when you're building a new product, a new company, a new service, or if you're an incumbent, that you're aware of these things, that gravity happens when you try to fly a plane, then your awareness puts you solidly in a position, not of panic or fear, but just consciousness of what you have to watch out for.
Yeah, I think the Hayden one is a really interesting post in that I got a quote there from that, and he says, it matters not whether you are pro-Lepore or pro-Christensen, but whether you are pro this debate. And I think that's the interesting thing, is that the debate hasn't happened for over a decade, and now it is starting to happen. But for me, if we just loop back to something, I think one of the problems here, and I'm not attacking Christensen at all, I think the book is brilliant and the idea is brilliant, and its impact has been even more brilliant. But the thing is, it's quite a narrow theory. And I think the problem with it is it's been applied widely, but it's actually very, very specific. And it's not Christensen's fault that it's been applied widely and used in cases that totally don't match. But I think if you're going to really talk about Christensen's theory, disruptive innovation, in quotes, then you have to apply it in the way that he wants it applied, which is very narrow. And we can get onto that if you like.
Correct. I think this is exactly the problem, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, Michael, I don't know when I can jump in.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is like we're sitting here, like, and I'm not attacking Christensen at all. I'm not. I think it's funny because I think Lepore, if you read between the lines I am pro the debate, because I read in between the lines, it is a political discussion. It seems to be, and I don't have privy to this and I haven't seen enough evidence on it, but there's definitely some kind of thing going on there where she's taking this into a logical, absurd extreme of it's a new view on history. It's a kind of way of history, but that's been more broad in the way that I want to say, the way we always talk about is cultural materialism, the way the culture has engaged disruption, like, so it's still relevant today if we apply these things, like I said, in terms of what's gravity, in terms of what wind shear is. And the thing is the other side of it is it's not supposed to be this sort of Silicon Valley, let's be the entrant, let's be the the rebel gang of that we're going to attack the incumbent. The irony is that for every whatever every entry level disruptive technology, disruptive innovation that's coming along, whatever that is, they always become the incumbent at some point downwind. What Apple did, I loved his example about the Newton, that if somebody else had come out with Newton and sold 140,000 units at what price point, 3,000, I can't remember what it was, but that would be a great start for an emerging disruptive company. But because it was already Apple and they were big, powerful Apple, that was a failure. So everything becomes contextual in terms of what success or failure means for any given organization.
Yeah, I think that's where the lean startup is actually tremendously helpful. And in my mind, that's like part 2 of this book, because it actually is the solution for big companies, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think it's not only the solution for big companies, but also to the individual innovation manager. Because since we're about criticism about this book, I think one of the issues, well, it's not his fault, obviously, because he never intended it to be a guideline for innovation managers. But this is, this is hardly something an innovation manager can lean on. It's a great framework to have in mind, of course, but this is really CEO literature, right?
Yeah, who's the intended audience?
That's a good question.
No, I was actually going to ask that. Who is the intended audience? Because I think it's changed from 20 years ago. I think it's changed from 1997. Clearly it was, I think he always thought of it as incumbent managers, and not even CEOs of, just specifically he had in mind, seems to me, CEOs of incumbent companies. That what they get wrong is not bad blood or mismanagement of funding or something like this. It's a new thing that hadn't been brought up before, and I think it's not uncoincidental that that he's coming up with this stuff at a time when the internet was nascent. I thought that was a really important. Whether it's coincidental or not, I think it's really a nice convergence, because not even from the disk drive stuff, because that was moving so fast, because it was also driven by a number of things digitally, but just the fact that the internet, the way of doing business changed, and that changed the competitive basis. It didn't always fit with what he's with the piece.
Yeah, I think in terms of the intended audience, for me, it's definitely managers, and I think that's because the whole sort of subtext of the book is that managers doing the right thing are actually doing the wrong thing. That's the problem. That's the dilemma, is that good managers and doing what they've been taught to do well and doing it in the context of what's good for their company is actually where the problem lies when it's about disruptive innovation. So I think it's aimed squarely.
But I think it's not. But this is not the problem he's aiming at, because it's obviously a problem for anyone who wants to deal with disruption. But it's not a problem for these managers, because they're just acting right. It's just the wrong people for disruptive innovation.
Well, I think
that's the interesting thing. No, because the funny thing is, Uber is probably content to sit back and watch people argue whether they are a disruptive model, because any press is good press. Sure. And having at the same time, talking about what he intended in the first place and who his target was in the first place is always fascinating too, because historically, these kinds of things always get reduced. I'm going to steal something from you, Timmy, but Machiavellian ends justification for the means, right? Ends justify the means, but we all know that, and not we all know, but if anybody were to take the time and go read the book and understand it's much more subtle than that, there's many more moving parts there, and there's many more variabilities that the actual work takes on. This is historically true. Whether it's business or anything, politics, whatever it might be, he set out to just basically give, some thoughts on some things that he was noticing that became a conversation changer. And that was what was new and fresh. It was really, sort of a warning with the intention for CEOs of incumbents. You should be aware of these things, and there are things you can do to change. However, the culture has seized on it, changed the entire meaning of the word disruption, and taken on a new ambiance, and kind of now has this battle cry in Silicon Valley. I think there's also something to be said politically, like what Hayden's working about in his article about the pro-debate piece is centered on the, first and foremost, both Lepore and Christensen are elites coming from a Harvard background who are, still channeling a sort of traditional viewpoint, and Silicon Valley has traditionally always sought to undercut that and disrupt that, if you to take advantage of this word.
Yeah, I still think it is aimed, for me it's like a self-help book for managers. I think the people that appreciate it most are CEOs, because it gives them a view that they can really understand about their company in its wider market space. But for managers, it's really like a self-help book. It's like, this could happen, here's one way of seeing it coming and ways you should respond in your area to disruption.
I think that's problematic though too, because in too often, and we see this, CEOs take books like this, take books like Good to Great, books like Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, distill them, misread them in many ways because they wanted to conform to their view, and kind of create a recipe. Well, if we do A, B, C, and D that Christensen says, we'll be fine. And you see this all the time. And then talk about, we built a disruptive, innovative company. We spent $100 million to do it, and it failed. It's like, well, you still didn't. And actually, you did not do what he said, because he never would have advocated going and investing $100 million in something and calling it a disruptive innovation. You probably were still working on sustaining innovation.
Yeah, I mean, here's
Let me back up.
Well, I've got a question. Maybe I can ask. Let me ask Alex. Right. So let's just segue into this. Alex, do you think the iPhone is a disruptive innovation? What does your gut tell you?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I think that the iPhone, I would say.
It doesn't really matter,
yes
actually.
No.
So, but what do you?
I guess I would lean towards yes, just because of what it opens as far as the the App Store and everything that you can now do with an iPhone versus what you could do before with this cellular phone.
Yeah, let me ask Ninetta as well. You haven't chimed in for a bit. So what would you say, yes or no?
Yeah, I would agree that it's disruptive. Just if you look how the iPhone and smartphones in general changed how people do their day-to-day business and what impact they have, I think it's a disruptive one.
Yeah, and I think most people would agree with you. Is my feeling. But here's the issue, Michael, right, is Clayton Christensen, according to his narrow theory, the iPhone is not a disruptive innovation. And of course he says this because it came in at the top of the market and it didn't focus on the low end and it didn't service the underserved. It came in with a better product. It was a sustaining innovation all the way. The problem with that is if you ask Nokia whether it was a sustaining innovation, they would say absolutely not. This was a killer. It destroyed our business, right? So it depends on the viewpoint. And I think there lies an issue. It's an academic theory used in a very narrow way, but it doesn't really help us in the wider perspective of lots of people being disrupted. Whether you call it Christensen's disruption or not, they are being disrupted.
I think one view for disruption is it a threat? So back to the Lyft and Uber example, to the cab drivers is a disruption because it's threatening their industry. So for them it shakes things up, and this is why they see it as a disruption.
Right, this is a great point.
And that
wait, let me
sorry.
jumping in here. Actually, it's thanks, Ninetta, because that actually was leading to my next question, especially to Ninetta, especially to Alex. because they haven't chimed in, and not because you haven't chimed in, but because I need more perspective. What you just described from Nokia, from Lyft, from taxi drivers, was perspective. And so it's fascinating. So from your perspective, Alex, you go first again. From your perspective, is there anything in this book that you could implement in your work life, in your personal life, or if you were talking to somebody today about what this means to you and how you could see application?
Right. Okay. So I do agree that perspective is everything. And as far as what I could apply from this book to my life at this moment, honestly, I don't know if there's a whole lot. I agree. I mean, it is geared towards manager and especially managers at higher end of the line, so to speak, that have authority to do things and such. But as far as a day-to-day person, I mean, it's interesting. I found it very interesting, and I enjoyed reading it. But as far as what I can apply from his principles to my life, I'm not really sure that there's a whole lot there.
Well, let's think about that. We might have more opportunity to offline conversations about that. Ninetta, how about you?
Yeah, I think for private life that's tough to apply, and business life.
Well, I would challenge both of you then, because here's what I would say. There is, if you take what, not so much even the narrow letter of the law piece of the thesis, but the idea that there's a change in the conversation because he didn't look at it and accept what have been commonly held principles for failure previously. So things where you have not, where you think you could have done better, not only could you have done better, is there a different view that you could take? So whether you call it disruptive or not, it actually would be to change the things that you've done in the past in regards to projects, in regards to, in my world, sales and business development, client relationships. I've been thinking about this, that, even it goes all the way through from the thesis part of the book and the pieces there to Lepore's criticism and Hayden Shaughnessy's metacriticism, as well as a few other articles that we really haven't been brought up here. I think there is, from a perspective standpoint, to start thinking beyond what the cultural elements of the innovator's dilemma and more about restarting the conversation, inserting a third position that hadn't previously arisen to me, and say, based on these things, like what are my resource dependencies in my personal life? I know, time, money, relationships, personal and work, professional. Those are all things that prospectively could be changed. Things that I have overlooked in terms, not even whether you call it small markets, but just places to spend my time, change my perspective, and that would disrupt, in effect, how I've always done things and always thought about things. And I think there's opportunity there.
I think the point of perspective is important. The whole idea with the dilemma, okay, you're doing the right things, but in the end, this is what makes you fail. To have that thought and step back and look at things differently and stop and think, okay, am I really doing the right things? It seems like I'm doing the right things, but maybe I'm not. I think, to your point, it's valuable to even reflect on anything that you do in your life and take that step back. I wouldn't have thought of it this way immediately, just because it's framed so much in the business and company context that, to me, it's more business related.
Yeah, but I just challenge you just to think about it, and we can, we'll probably have more conversations off the podcast. But I do think that there is some things that I think perspective not only from what the book and the institution of Innovator's Dilemma has, fraught or facilitated in our cultural conversations, but I think that there's something there. I haven't been fleshed out, but I've been thinking about it a lot, that there's a different view here that maybe it's just like, if it's as simple as can't do the same old things that we've done because there's too many different perspectives to bring into the question. Ask different questions, change the conversation. Mitch, how about you? Have you thought about that?
Well, yeah, of course. In general, I would agree with Alex and Netta, though, because just a change of perspective that's just too broad. I mean, that's a suggestion I can take from loads of books, like Daniel Goleman, EQ, which I read when I was 16. That was awesome and much more about changing perspective. However, I think that's not so much the issue, actually, because it's not whether I can take so much away from this for my personal life. It does help. That's the point. It does help me understand business in a different way. It does help me frame certain discussions with customers in another way. And I think this is what's actually important about this book. It's not so much what I can personally take away from my personal life for this. It does help. It is a great piece of work for the innovation market, and I would certainly recommend it. Like I said, the only point about it the only caveat that I have is basically that it is not a step-by-step guidance for the innovator, basically, like the Lean Startup was, which is still my favorite from everything we've read so far.
Tim, last word?
Well, I think there's quite I feel like there's a lot we still need to cover, but I think in terms of where the book
We can keep going. We're at an hour right now.
I think there's one more thing we probably need to touch on a little bit, but then we can wrap it up. But certainly, to answer the question, I think where it serves most motivation is actually for startups or for the entrepreneur, because really it's a hugely motivating book. It says to them, you don't actually need to create a competitive product to be successful. You can come in and create something really small, like the Lean Startup would say, get early validation and start serving the fringe customers. And I think that's hugely motivating. It says you can look at any industry pretty much and get some kind of foothold at the bottom of the market and then work your way up. And that's just, it's like a great manifesto for how to begin a startup. On the flip side of it, it's quite scary for incumbents, this book. I think and that's useful because it's actually highlighting where blind spots might be. And of course it gives you that advice to say, well, and really there's only one point of advice in the whole book, and it's really that if you're going to defend against this, you have to spin out and do it in a separate value network. You have to get away from your existing business, otherwise it's going to kill this idea. So, and that's useful, but that's where I think you need to spin off and look at the Lean Startup and say, okay, we need to embed the Lean Startup in our company. That's going to help us protect against these. But so from my point, I get motivated reading it, sort of rubbing my hands thinking, where can we create a startup? It's quite exciting. And of course, being part of a small company, smaller company, we're not the size of IBM, it serves as motivation for that as well, to move up the chain.
Yeah, and just to kind of go back even overarching, I mean, I wasn't thinking of like this was a spiritual change. It does, it comes into my conversations though. I'm thinking about this. I get very passionate about what, there is definitely a distinction between what Clayton Christensen said, the innovator's dilemma, and what disruptive technology is, to where it is now, 17 years later, 20 years later. There's no doubt. That's not the problem, but I don't mean it to say like Mitch, okay, you read a book at 16 and that give you a different perspective on life. That's not really what I mean, but I don't want to discount the way that because if you get passionate about saying, wow, I'm going to be able to do a new startup, and I've got some key dynamics that I can focus on, and this kind of motivates me to do that. I think it's more about having these kinds of conversations that get beyond the simplified version, the diluted version of what disruptive means, and that sort of becomes almost its own sort of eating itself a joke. In effect, I mean, a Silicon Valley TV show shows that very, very nicely. I think more impactful is the conversations that can lead you to stuff like Lean Startup, to doing things where you have to think about, like in the electric vehicle case, going back to some of the data, actually being able to say, yeah, I don't know where the market is, but I've got some data that I can start doing some lean types of testing with minimal investment. If you can be passionate about that there is something there. That, I think, is what's, that's more impactful for continued dialogue and perspective, because, and I'm rambling, I'm sorry, because just like you were saying, Tim, you can hit this head on anywhere. I mean, we're a small company. I know we've been around a while in terms of this, but in the U.S. especially, I definitely think of us as a startup, and I'm definitely looking around and saying, where are the places where we could, take this on as a very, very much in the same mindset that's elucidated in the Innovator's Dilemma, and as well as Lean Startup Strategy.
Yeah, I think it gives great hope for anybody starting out, actually, or small companies. I think we just got to touch on one thing, and it's only fair to Christensen to actually touch on this, I think, in a way. Not that he's ever going to listen to this, but is that just last month he produced an article in the Harvard Business Review that's like, a kind of backing up of his theory. I don't know if anyone read that, but it's a really interesting article. And I think we just need to highlight a couple of the points he made that really he's trying to back up his theory. And I think maybe it's a response to Jill Lepore and others, of course. Maybe he felt compelled to bring it out. So there are 4 key points, and 2 of them are important and 2 are not so important. But if you don't mind, I'll just list them. All right. So the first one is critical. He's saying disruption is a process. So it's not you can't look at any technology at any fixed point in time and say, is it disruptive or not? That's misunderstanding his idea. His idea is about a trajectory. It's about a process. And the question you have to ask is, regardless of what this product does or whether you think it's disruptive, is it on a disruptive path? So, for example, Netflix, originally that was not disruptive. Netflix was mail order. You had to wait 3 or 4 days to get the disc through the post. This was serving a different kind of customer to the people that wanted to drive on the same day and get a disc from Blockbuster. So Blockbuster were right. This was not a threat at the particular time. The problem is Netflix were on a journey, and they were moving up. And when they moved online and used the catalog online, they suddenly became an enormous threat to Blockbuster. But that was the path that they were on. And the same is true, conversely, the same is not true of Uber. They have not been on this disruptive path. They suddenly come out at the top end of the market and been a direct competitor to taxis. That's why they don't fit his mold. So that's the first one. And I think that really makes it clear, certainly in his mind, that if you're going to say, is this disruptive innovation according to his theory, yes or no, this really clarifies it. And the same is true of Apple. So, and the second point he makes is related to Apple, and that's that disruptors often build business models that are very different from those of incumbents. And this is where he's adjusted his theory, and that's really important. It's not in the first edition of the book. It's in this article, though, and he says, okay, originally I said you had to get a foothold in the market to be a disruptor, but now actually it could be that you're coming in from a different, a new market, shall we say. And he says Apple was not disruptive to the phone industry. They were disruptive to the laptop and PC industry because they came in and basically gave people a more popular way to access the internet. And that was hugely disruptive to desktops and PCs and laptops. But again, I think Nokia would would say that that's not the case. They were hugely disruptive to the phone industry. But those 2 are the critical points, okay? So that's his theory in a nutshell. And the last 2 points he makes are that some disruptive innovators succeed and some don't. And that's okay. We can't just simply say any successful company is a disruptive innovation. That leads us down a really dangerous path. And he even says, I'll quote, if we call every business success a disruption, then companies that rise to the top in very different ways will be seen as sources of insight into a common strategy for succeeding. And that's going to give managers a huge a misleading way of looking at handling disruption. So he's saying stick to the theory, be strict about it, and then we can learn something from those cases more easily. And finally, number 4 is that the mantra of disrupt or be disrupted can also misguide us. And the focus really, so if you feel like you're being disruptive, the response is not to tear down your business that's quite profitable and doing quite well. That should not be the panic response. It should actually be, okay, if we think this is serious, we need to spin out a separate division, like he's always said, give it freedom to not play by the same rules of the existing company, and then see where that goes and challenge the disruption head on. So those are the 4 points that I think reading that article does give the theory more credibility in today's world.
Yeah, actually, I did read the article, and I do think that, I mean, those are key points. I also understand, it's one of those things. What I'm fascinated about is this continuation of whether it's gospel or whether it's theory, and the differentiation between being a CEO at an incumbent and being a CEO of a gang in a garage, in effect. that you, because of the perspective piece of it, and because it's hard to maintain those things in terms of what you're trying to do today. I mean, some of the, things are moving so much more quickly than they even did in 1997 in terms of application. So even when you talk about lean startup, I think that the trick to even applying lean startup is saying, which do we do first to build in the first place? And again, at the end of the day, what we're trying to get to is data points. We're trying to get to some sort of data points to say, yes, we've actually we're headed in the right direction with the product, we're headed in the right direction with the customers, how do the customers use the product, and then can we build on this? I was on a call yesterday with some consultants, and they were talking, what we do is we de-risk these things as far up front in our conversation as we can. It's like, what kind of data are you using to drive that risk and uncertainty out? And they said, CEO assumptions. And I was just stunned. I think the call just went like 5 seconds of silence going, how is that? I think that the case at the end of the day is like whatever data we can start to look at to make the best decisions as quickly and efficiently and cost effectively as possible in any piece of the business or professional life or any part of our life.
Yeah, I think he also, just importantly, acknowledges that universal effective responses to disruptive threats remain elusive. So he's acknowledging that this, the problem is not solved here either. This is a theory for just helping you identify the scenarios, I guess.
Well, I like Clayton Christensen's flexibility in general anyway. I think that that's a good thing rather than being, nope, I planted my flag and that's it. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge he's made a career off that. Just this book has coined an entire, new world view, and there's something to be good about that, and also something to be taken to task for that.
Yeah, and it begs the question whether an updated version of it would be appreciated with new digital platforms, considered. Even Amazon, Bitcoin, Airbnb, are these fitting his model or not? But I don't know, maybe to draw it to a close, Michael, it raises the question of whether we would recommend this book for people to read, right?
Yeah, Mitch is already on record. Right, Mitch?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, I would definitely recommend it. Anyone who's busy in the innovation sector to read it. I mean, it's the framework, whether gospel or not. I mean, if it's gospel, then even more. But I would definitely recommend reading it. Yes, it shaped our industry.
Alex?
Yeah, I would definitely recommend reading it. I found it very interesting, and it definitely did shape the industry, and it is worth reading it for that point alone. But I would recommend it on all accounts.
Inetta?
Well, it's one of the books, and whether you take a lot from it or not, I still would say, okay, you should have it on your reading list.
Tim?
Yeah, I'm gonna say it's a good book and it is worth a read. But honestly, I think the article in HBR is more valuable right now, and I think that should be the first thing to read. And if you're still interested in understanding the nuts and bolts, then read the book.
Yeah, that's the case. It's like how much you really go in. My recommendation would be read the book, but keep an open mind to I think it's still relevant, but I think it's interestingly probably even more an artifact of the late 90s than, say, something like Lean Startup. I think Lean Startup, obviously newer, in this century, but the Lean Startup in its own way, I mean, I think comparatively speaking, is more relevant for still even 10 years later. The things that are going on with that, I can't remember the exact date, it was 2008. But I would also recommend that you not only the Harvard Business, but even just taking into other criticism and approaching it less from a more of an open-minded, objective standpoint. I don't think that Christensen is dogmatic. I don't think he's preaching a gospel in the sense of preaching a gospel, but I do believe he does have a sort of very strongly identified with this reputation, as disruption, an innovator's dilemma. But it's got to be something that's always going to be taken into account, that there's a more definitive, more subtle theory behind just throwing disruption or out into the marketplace.
Amen.
So, well, we've gone quite a bit longer in this podcast. I hope anybody's still staying with it, got something out of the long discussion. I think it's been really fun for us. I hope it was fun for everybody on the call. It's fun for me. And Tim, you want to any other final closeout words?
Well, at least we got this one out of the way now.
On to the next one.
We can get on with some
I think this is going to resonate with us for quite a while still.
It's a baseline, isn't it? It's a language.
Yeah, it really has set that. I think there's going to be we're going to have to revisit some classics along the same lines in good to great and good strategy, bad strategy, but then also some new ones like the business canvas coming up. So I'm really looking forward to kind of see how this tempers ongoing discussions. So thanks everybody for staying with it.
Until next time, guys. See you in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.